Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the presidency. This week we will discuss the roles and responsibilities of the president, the evolution of the power of office, how other institutions of government check this power, and the important role of presidential personality and character. But first, how about a short video?
Thuiswerken, dat is nog niet zo makkelijk. Thuiswerken, dat is nog niet zo makkelijk. Thuiswerken, dat doe je graag alleen. Dan is het vaak vervelend met iemand anders om je heen.
Oh, stop!
Maar je hebt de tweede mogen laten.
So first, I'd like to start with the constitutional foundations of presidential power. As you will recall, Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution enumerates the qualifications for the office of the presidency. Candidates must be natural-born citizens, at least 35 years of age, and U.S. residents for at least 14 years. However, the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution states that presidents shall not be elected to more than 2 terms of office, meaning that presidents can only serve a maximum of 8 years in office. This is, of course, complicated in the case that the vice president succeeds the president. Either the president dies, is no longer fit for office, resigns, or is impeached. If the vice president succeeds the president with less than 2 years remaining in the original president's term, they may run for re-election twice, thus resulting in a possible maximum term length of 10 years. The Constitution grants the president 2 distinct types of power: express powers and implied powers. Expressed powers are those directly granted to the president by the Constitution. For instance, Article 2, Section 2 states that the president shall preside over the bureaucracy, which we will discuss in much more detail next week. It also states that the president will be the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces, enter into treaties with foreign nations, and make judicial and executive appointments, which shall be approved by the Senate. Implied powers are derived by the rather murky language of the Take Care Clause in Article 2, Section 3, which ambiguously states that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, what the hell does that actually mean? Remember, this intentionally vague language is fraught throughout the Constitution, just like the Necessary and Proper Clause for Congress in Article 1, which basically says, hey, Congress, you can make whatever laws are necessary and proper to the functioning of our government. And again, this vague language was used purposefully to ensure that the governing document of our country, the Constitution, would be able to evolve and accommodate society for hundreds of years to come. So basically, the president also has the power to do anything that enables him or her to take care that the laws of the land are executed. So generally, this takes form in the manner of the president creating new bureaucratic departments in times of crisis, just like President George W. Bush did in 2001 by creating the Department of Homeland Security, or vis-a-vis executive orders, which we will talk about in more detail later on. So last week we learned that the primary responsibility of Congress is to make the laws, and today we're going to talk all about the president's primary responsibility, which is to enforce those laws. So how does the president use their expressed and implied powers to enforce the law? Well, to really understand that, we need to take a deep dive into the specific roles and expectations of the presidency. The president is responsible for managing or leading 7 distinct roles in office. Not only does the president oversee the entire executive branch, but they also play critical roles in the legislature and the judiciary. The president is also the United States chief international diplomat, military commander, and represents the apex of the political party they belong to. And finally, in a more abstract or symbolic way, the president is also the leader of public opinion. In other words, the president is perhaps the most salient figure that shapes public discourse and opinion. And I'd like to go over each of these in a little bit more detail. First, the president as executive leader. The most apparent role of the president is to make sure that the laws written by Congress are actually enacted or enforced. And this primarily happens through the bureaucracy. So last week we spent a lot of time talking about this hypothetical all school buses must stop at railroad crossings bill, and all of the steps required for that bill to become a law and become enforceable. Once a bill becomes a law, that means that a corresponding agency in the executive branch, which in this case would be the United States Department of Transportation, becomes responsible for carrying out or enforcing that law. Now, we'll talk about how different agencies carry out these actions in far more detail next week, but what you need to know for now is that the president is in charge of organizing and managing virtually all aspects of the bureaucracy. And when we say bureaucracy, we're essentially talking about the 15 executive or cabinet departments of the presidency. So many textbooks will often prompt students to think about the presidency as like the CEO of a big company, which is ironically more true than ever today, but think of the president like the head of a massive company, and it's his responsibility to manage all of the staff and make sure that the company meets its goals. So one of the first things that a president needs to do after being elected is to essentially stack the bureaucracy with people he can trust to make sure that the laws will be enforced in accordance with his own policy preferences. This is the president's cabinet, the people he appoints to run and manage the 15 executive bureaucratic departments in government who must be vetted and approved by the United States Senate before taking office. The president also makes budgetary recommendations to the House of Representatives. Remember, from last week, all revenue bills begin in the House of Representatives. So the president often makes recommendations to the chamber on how he thinks or prefers how money ought to be delegated to each department. And this is where party ideology really comes into play. We know Democrats tend to favor social welfare and educational programs, so we often see Democratic presidents advocating for stronger budget allocations to these departments, while Republicans are generally perceived with strong policy competence in international affairs, defense, and regulating spending, so they're more likely to seek budgetary increases for these departments to help pursue their agenda. Again, politics. Who gets what? One of the president's most controversial implied powers concerns the use of executive orders. Let's take a look at what these are in a bit more detail. Contrary to what a lot of people actually believe, executive orders are not laws. Remember, laws may only be written by members of Congress. Executive orders are merely declarations made by the president that influence the organization or the function of the federal bureaucracy. So let's watch a quick video that discusses the differences between a law and an executive order.
On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln legally changed the status of over 3 million enslaved blacks across 10 states from slave to free. His Emancipation Proclamation wasn't a law or a presidential decree, it was an executive order. The framers of the American Constitution made the power of the executive order available to the executive branch. But what exactly is this tool? How does it work? And what is the extent of its power? Well, an executive order isn't a law, but it can carry the weight of one. Passing laws involves a fairly lengthy process. First, a member of Congress proposes a piece of legislation in the form of a bill. After many committees and revisions, if the bill is approved by a majority of votes in Congress, that is, both the House and Senate, the bill is then sent to the president for signature. If the president signs the bill, it then becomes a law. An executive order, on the other hand, is something the president issues without consultation or permission from Congress. They are, however, enforced like laws and are subject to judicial review by the court system to make sure they're within the limits of the Constitution. That means the courts have the power to invalidate any executive decisions that they determine are an overreach of the president in trying to assert power. And once the president leaves office, if his or her successor wants to eliminate the executive order, they can do so. So when does a president use an executive order? Sometimes a president feels the need to exert power without working with Congress, and in times of crisis, quick decisions can be justified. But most executive orders are not responses to emergencies. They're often directed towards agencies in the federal government in order to expand or contract their power. Others determine the extent to which legislation should be enforced. And sometimes, a president may use an executive order to clarify and help implement a policy that needs to be easily defined. Some of the most famous executive orders have changed the course of American history. FDR issued an executive order to establish the Works Progress Administration, which helped build thousands of roads, bridges, and parks throughout the country. The WPA also employed thousands of writers, painters, sculptors, and artists to create works of art in public spaces. Additionally, Harry Truman used an executive order to desegregate the armed forces in 1948. And in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order to establish requirements for non-discriminatory practices in hiring and employment. Executive orders have often been used in positive and inclusive ways, but they've also been used to exclude and divide. One of the most notable examples being FDR's 1942 executive order. He gave the military authority to target predominantly Japanese Americans, as well as German Americans and Italian Americans in certain regions across the country. This executive order also removed any or all of those people into military zones, most commonly known as internment camps. Beginning in the early 1960s, each president has issued roughly 300 executive orders, but FDR issued over 3,500. At the other end of the spectrum, William Henry Harrison never issued an executive order, probably because his presidency only lasted 31 days. The U.S. Constitution is somewhat ambiguous on the extent of the president's power. That's resulted in executive orders expanding over time. For instance, since Lyndon Johnson, presidents have begun issuing orders to create faith-based initiatives, establish federal agencies, and remove barriers for scientific research. There are checks and balances in the U.S. political system. Congress can pass laws to counteract executive orders, and judges can halt them by deeming them unconstitutional. But in the time it takes for those things to happen, an executive order can go into effect and possibly change the course of history, for better or for worse.
So I think this video does a really good job of highlighting the key elements of executive orders. A lot of people assume that executive orders are inherently dangerous or produce bad policy, like in 1993 when Bill Clinton establishes the military's "don't ask, don't tell" policy through an executive order that allowed gays and lesbians to serve in the armed forces as long as they were not open about their sexual orientation. This executive order set a damaging precedent for the political rights and freedoms of the LGBTQ+ community that was not reversed until almost 2 decades later when President Obama took office. But presidents can also use this power to somewhat re-enfranchise individuals, such as President Obama's executive order, which removed notices of criminal records from federal job applications. However, this does not apply to the state level. Lastly, as the video mentioned, presidents can also use executive orders to advance negative agenda. This is any type of action that prevents or stymies a policy agenda. President Trump essentially ran on the negative agenda policy platform of repealing President Obama's legacy, primarily by way of the Affordable Care Act. On his first day in office, President Trump issued an executive order that waived the Affordable Care Act's financial penalties for uninsured individuals. So these are just a couple of examples of how executive orders work in practice. And together with the ability to appoint all heads of the executive departments and the delegated powers of making budgetary recommendations, the president really does reign somewhat supreme in the executive. And finally, the power to invoke executive privilege is just as murky, if not murkier, than the use of executive orders. Executive privilege is another implied power of the presidency that allows presidents to withhold certain information from either the public or other governmental institutions. The president's justification for invoking executive privilege usually boils down to either 1. Protecting matters of national security, or 2. Protecting the privacy of active White House engagements. Executive privilege has been used throughout history from George Washington to Donald Trump for a variety of motives. Perhaps the most blatant abuse of this power, however, occurred when President Richard Nixon tried to withhold audio tape recordings from evidence presented to the courts concerning his awareness of criminal activity conducted by his campaign in the Watergate scandal. Though Nixon's attempt at executive privilege was later dismissed by the Supreme Court, many have used it quite successfully, President Trump being no exception. In just 1 month, President Trump used executive privilege to block Congress from obtaining documents about the census citizenship question, invoked it to bar the full Mueller report from being given to Congress, and used it to bar his former White House counsel, Don McGahn, from providing documents to Congress. So there's a nasty pattern among presidents to try to invoke executive privilege to shield them from their own wrongdoings. Nixon used it to distance himself from the Watergate scandal. Bill Clinton used it to distance himself from the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and Trump has used it to distance himself as well from the Russian electoral interference scandal. Even though there's no limit or restraint placed on the number of times a president can invoke executive privilege, they must consider, or they should consider, three distinct audiences when making these decisions. 1. How is Congress going to react? The more concerned they become, the more they'll fight back and stall the president's agenda. 2. What will the courts decide? And keep in mind, the decisions that the courts make set legal precedents which can limit the scope of executive privilege. And 3. What will the people think? The public can usually tolerate a little bit of secrecy, but when a presidential administration becomes completely shrouded by secrecy, you're likely to lose a lot of public support, which won't bode well for your re-election. So as you can see, the checks on the president's implied powers are more abstract than actual structural restraints. Second, the president as legislative leader. Okay, so last week when we were talking about Congress, we discussed some of the most important legislative powers of the president, and that's because the president's power to veto is actually in Article 1 of the Constitution, not Article 2. That's a good exam question right there. The president's power to veto legislation is his most powerful legislative power. For the most part, the president really has the final word on what becomes law and what does not. Now, as you should remember, Congress can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers, but the stars essentially have to align for this to happen. Since George Washington, only about 4% of presidential vetoes have been overridden successfully by Congress. This also generally requires that the party challenging the president have a sizable majority in both chambers. Thus, vetoes are most likely when the party controlling Congress is different from the president's party. But vetoes also have political consequences. Specifically, they can be used to create a narrative against the president that he or she is unwilling to compromise or work with Congress. We've already discussed how difficult it is for most bills to become law, so when a president vetoes that legislation, it can sometimes create the illusion of dysfunction in government as a direct consequence of the president's actions. It's also very common for political challengers to call attention to legislation vetoed by presidents or governors as an example of poor judgment, just like the Willie Horton ad that we watched in class where George Bush Sr. portrayed Governor Dukakis's veto of mandatory minimum sentencing as a dangerous and reckless move. So while the veto is undeniably a significant power of the presidency, it nonetheless has its consequences and of course is not absolute. Lesser presidential powers include Congress allowing the president to make policy recommendations at the beginning of the session, though this is really only a factor under unified government. Or if a president was elected on a platform of major policy reform, as was the case of Obama, who garnered much of his support based upon his ideas for universal health care. So as you can see, a president gets elected because of big policy ideas. That means that the people are really on board with these ideas, so it's really in Congress's best interest to write a law to satisfy the will of the people. Finally, you have the annual State of the Union address. This is considered a legislative power of the president because he uses it to set the policy agenda by describing to Congress what sorts of legislation he would be willing to sign in the coming year. But really, I think the State of the Union is completely useless. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. I think really the only purpose of the State of the Union serves to create political theater. And I would love to just show you an example from the most recent State of the Union this past February.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States.
Okay, so this whole thing is like an hour and a half long, and we're obviously not going to watch the entire thing, but I just wanted to call your attention to a few things. So first, the president comes in and he shakes everyone's hands, and it's not more than 2 minutes in, and it's already off to a horrible start. Watch here. Nancy Pelosi goes to shake Donald Trump's hand, and he totally blows her off. And I think the best part is that, Melania is just totally digging it. And this is really going to set the tone for the rest of the night. So listen to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, introduce President Donald Trump. This is key.
Members of Congress, the President of the United States.
Now, traditionally, the Speaker of the House will say, "Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States." And she doesn't say that at all. Instead, all she says is, "Members of Congress, the President of the United States." And watch here, after President Trump's introduction, all of the Republicans over here on this side of the screen start chanting, "4 more years."
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that's really the bulk of it, folks. The Republicans are super psyched that their dude is in power, and the Democrats are really pissed off that they have to sit through an hour and a half of grandstanding. And watch this. At the end of almost every single sentence, the entire right side of the chamber will give the president a standing ovation, and the Democrats just sit there silently expressing their opposition. And all of this behavior is incredibly strategic, right? You've got the most politically engaged individuals at home watching this, and they want to see how their congressman is going to react. You'll notice, maybe you'll see it again in this video, but a few key Democrats will stand up when no one else is. And that's generally because these are more moderate Democrats. So they're not going to sit there silently and oppose every single thing that the president says. They want to demonstrate to their constituents back home that they are listening, they are being engaged, and they are behaving as the moderate politicians that they were elected to be. And like I said, we're not going to watch the entire thing, but all you really need to know is that the rest of this speech truly unfolds like a season finale of a reality TV show. You've got this sweet kid who just wants to grow up and be an astronaut, and Trump uses it as an opportunity to talk about his space force that he's just created. You've got this 4th grade little girl who just wants to go to a nice charter school, but she can't because, as Trump so aptly points out, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania is a total dick and doesn't care about kids. So instead, Trump steps in and he gives her a scholarship to go to the school of her choice. And watch this absolute revolt by the Democrats here. So President Trump has just asked for bipartisan legislation to reduce the price of prescription drugs. And he says on the spot, get it, write it together, make sure it's bipartisan, put it on my desk, and I will sign it. And then the Democrats just start booing and going crazy. And here they're chanting H.R. 3, which is House Resolution Bill 3 that they had written earlier that proposed to do exactly what Donald Trump is asking from them. Though prior to the State of the Union, Trump made it abundantly clear that he planned on vetoing that bill because he didn't like how the Democrats had attempted to make those cuts.
With unyielding commitment, we are curbing the opioid epidemic.
And then Trump really pulls out the tearjerker material towards the end. He awards Rush Limbaugh the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and Rush Limbaugh cries a little bit. And then, towards the very end of the night, Trump introduces this military spouse, mother of 2. She hasn't seen her husband in months because he's been deployed to Afghanistan. And like a scene out of a Lifetime movie, Trump says, "But wait, there's more. I've got a surprise for you." And her husband comes walking down the stairs to meet his family for the first time in months. And it is just gold, and the Republicans are loving it. They think they're just creating this incredible, happy, feel-good, Reagan-esque moment for America. And all the while, you have the Democrats who are still just, really refusing to acknowledge anything that's going on. So, yeah, like I said at the beginning, I think the State of the Union has just been so politicized. I don't really think it offers many legitimate political benefits or advantages. I guess besides the internet meme content it creates, the internet about lost its mind here at the very end when Donald Trump signs off his address and Nancy Pelosi just starts ripping up Trump's transcript at the end of the night. So that's basically what you're missing from the State of the Union address. Okay, so back on topic. Third, the president as judicial appointer. So one of the most obvious powers of the president over the judicial branch is his power to nominate judges, not only to the Supreme Court, but all judges in federal courts as well. The president's power to appoint judges is an express power laid out in Article 2, Section 2 that is also subject to Senate approval and requires a majority vote. In a couple weeks, we will discuss the qualifications of Supreme Court justices, but what you need to know for now is that justices on the Supreme Court serve lifelong appointments. They're not elected, and they do not undergo any type of annual performance review. Once a judge sits on the Supreme Court, they are there for good. And the Founding Fathers were very intentional about this. They didn't want judges beholden to a political party or a special interest or some political machine, so they decided that giving judges lifelong appointments would help ensure that judges remained impartial or unbiased when interpreting the law. So removing the politics from the scenario should achieve this end, but almost everyone agrees anyway that judges are still partisan. We talk about conservative judges and liberal judges. Why does this happen? Well, that is something that we will discuss in about 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. But what I want to focus on for now is the effects that this power has for the presidency. Giving the president the power to make these lifelong judicial appointments means that the president's powers and their ideologies really extend far beyond their term of office. So here are the 9 Supreme Court justices. And again, we're going to talk about them in a lot more detail in a few weeks, but these are the 9 individuals who get to decide what is constitutional and what is not constitutional in our country. And I want to call your attention to this man here, Clarence Thomas. Currently, he is the most senior justice in the Supreme Court. He's been on the bench for almost 3 decades. Now, Clarence Thomas was appointed by Republican President George Bush Sr. all the way back in 1991. President Clinton appointed Ginsburg and Breyer. George W. Bush appointed Roberts and Alito. President Obama appointed Sotomayor and Kagan. And so far, President Trump has appointed Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. So we can see the incredible, long-lasting effect of judicial appointments. So I think what's interesting is that as the world becomes increasingly complicated, technology becomes more advanced, and issues like digital privacy and bodily autonomy come more to the forefront of American politics. For the most part, the people sitting on the Supreme Court can very easily have their ideologies stuck in the early 1990s. And that's something that I want you to pay attention to and keep in mind as we get ready to talk about the judiciary in the coming weeks. Fourth, the president as head diplomat. So the Constitution gives the president the ability to enter into treaties with foreign nations, but the president must obtain the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. So there's a pretty big check on the president when it comes to entering foreign agreements with foreign nations. But again, the president can engage in some clever political maneuvering to get what he wants. Okay, so first let's say that a president ran on a platform of climate change and had an opportunity to sign onto an international climate change treaty. Imagine also, just for the sake of argument, that Congress was full of people who don't believe in climate change, and the president knows that Congress will never approve this treaty. And so if he sends it to Congress for their approval, it'll just be a big waste of everybody's time. So the one thing that the president can do is he can sign the treaty anyway, but never send it to Congress for actual ratification. That way the president still maintains a record of promoting the policies that he campaigned on. And this is pretty much what President Clinton did with the international agreement on the Kyoto Protocol. He signed it, but he never sent it to Congress for its ratification. Another thing the president can do is enter into an executive agreement with another country. Now, executive agreements don't carry the same weight as a legally binding treaty with congressional approval, but you can kind of think of executive agreements as being politically binding, or a politically binding agreement between 2 heads of state. These type of agreements are pretty common in proxy war scenarios. Typically, the United States will enter into some type of executive agreement with a foreign country that's at war to provide goods or supplies while otherwise trying to remain neutral during the conflict. And this is precisely what happened back in the 1940s when FDR entered an agreement with the United Kingdom to help provide, I believe, vehicles, tanks perhaps, without formally entering World War II. Finally, the president is also responsible for appointing diplomats and serving as the symbolic head of state and representing the country internationally. And while that second one might not sound too important, it actually has a significant amount of weight to it. By the president acknowledging some country as legitimate or another country as illegitimate, that can have a massive impact on the global stage and influence, the extent to which other countries, particularly those that we are in alliances with, are willing to acknowledge or to not acknowledge states as legitimate. Fifth, the president as head of the military. The Constitution appoints the president as the highest-ranking officer of the United States Armed Forces. So in this capacity, he serves as the commander-in-chief of the military and communicates directly with the top civilian and military leaders of the Department of Defense. One of the biggest controversies of presidential power stems from the president's involvement in military affairs without congressional approval. Do not forget, the Constitution explicitly states that the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the president. The ability to declare war is spelled out in Article 1 of the Constitution, not Article 2. And throughout our nation's history, the United States has declared war 5 times, but has been involved in hundreds of military conflicts around the world. So how does this happen? How did the office of the presidency amass such power? Well, to really understand all of this, it requires yet another brief lesson in history. Well, our story begins in Vietnam, the easternmost country on the Southeast Asian Indochinese peninsula. Indochina was a French colony during the 19th century. And when the Japanese invaded during World War II, the Viet Minh, or the League of the Independence of Vietnam, opposed the Japanese with the support of not only the United States, but the Soviet Union, as well as China. Now, ultimately, Japan was forced to surrender, and the Viet Minh inherited a sizable inventory of weapons. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the communist-led Viet Minh then initiated an insurgency against French rule for independence, and after 100 years of colonial rule, the French were forced to leave Vietnam in July 1954. And that same month, now this is important, that same month, President Eisenhower deploys military aid to South Vietnam in efforts to contain the spread of communism from North Vietnam. So this was all during that phase of Cold War era communist containment. And this is the beginning of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, or perhaps more appropriately, the Vietnam conflict, considering that the United States military operations never received formal authorization from Congress. So what happened in Vietnam? Why are we talking about Vietnam? Well, Eisenhower's actions slowly get the United States involved in 1954, and it spans the length of 4 presidencies: Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And the conflict escalates significantly over time. So what the Vietnamese saw as a war of independence, the United States saw as a war of communist containment. So while Ho Chi Minh is running trails all throughout the country to arm his countrymen in South Vietnam, the U.S. perceives him as an aggressor. So fast forward a couple years, JFK is elected and wants to get the country out of Vietnam, but in 1963, he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So now, succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson, we have the 3rd president now involved in this ongoing conflict with seemingly no end in sight. Fast forward a few more years to 1964, this pivotal event, I want you to note, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is where the United States government alleges that the destroyer naval vessel, the USS Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedoes. And the details of this event are somewhat suspect. Remind you of anything? The USS Maine story that we talked about several weeks ago? At any rate, LBJ takes this as a massive sign of aggression from North Vietnam and takes this information to Congress. And basically, Congress just responds with this Gulf of Tonkin resolution that essentially gives LBJ unprecedented military and financial authorizations. He can basically do whatever he wants. LBJ used this expanded power to wreak absolute havoc and destruction on North Vietnam. Under President Johnson, the U.S. dropped more than 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina. That's more than triple the amount of bombs the U.S. dropped on the entire European theater of World War II. Some estimate that the U.S. killed close to 3 million Vietnamese during the conflict, while about 54,000 Americans were killed. It would take 9 more years of continued U.S. defeats before public opinion soured enough to make Nixon recall the last remaining troops in 1973, just 1 year before his resignation. So basically, I think we all know that the United States' involvement in Vietnam was a horrible disaster, and Congress realized that it had absolutely bungled its handling of presidential intervention in the Vietnam conflict. So Congress responds by passing the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973, and that implemented 2 critical measures. First, it required that the president notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action. And second, forbids armed forces from remaining in conflict for more than 60 days without congressional approval. So that should be the end of it, right? No more unauthorized presidential military action. Well, unfortunately, the War Powers Resolution Act has actually done very little to curb presidential power over the military. And basically, this is because presidents have interpreted their power as commander-in-chief to mean that they can mobilize troops without a formal declaration of war from Congress if it is in the interest of protecting and preserving the United States Constitution. And which in our lifetime has generally been construed to mean the containment of terrorism, argued to be an inherent threat to global democracy. And so we generally see that Congress allows the president, whatever means necessary to contain the spread of terrorism. So we can see that this murky language from the Founding Fathers in Article 2 is actually coming around to bite us. And in fact, the constitutional language that was designed to specifically prevent miscarriages of justice has instead fostered them. 6. The president as public opinion leader. So the 2 remaining roles that I want to talk about regarding the presidency are a little bit more abstract or symbolic than the previous roles that we have discussed. In many ways, the president represents the will and the opinions of the people. I mean, after all, the candidate who gets the most votes of the people becomes the president, at least in most cases, right? So we often see that the president will advocate for or fight for the things that are important to the people who voted for them. And in 2008, all the way through 2016, very well into 2020, revamping the healthcare system continues to be a major issue among most Americans. And these issues have really dominated the office of the presidency over the last 12 years. Signing the Affordable Care Act into law, aka Obamacare, is really the hallmark of President Obama's legacy. And ever since, Republican candidates have staunchly ran on the platform of repeal and replace. And even today, as we're getting ready for the 2020 elections, we see Democrats advocating for different variations of, Medicare for all, plans in attempt to appeal to the majority sentiments of the public. So it's not surprising that either on the debate stage during the campaign or in the Oval Office on the president's first day, that they prioritize the issues that are most salient or important to the public, which thus far has really been dominated by healthcare. 7. The president as party leader. The presidency is the highest level of elected office in the United States. And with our 2-party system, this means that the president also serves as the head of the party in many regards. And so when you have somebody like a political outsider or an anti-establishment candidate running for office and actually wins, this forces the party to make some radical changes. This is what a lot of people are hopeful will happen, for if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, that it will radically change the way the Democratic Party behaves, though that's not looking too likely these days. But I want you to think back to when Donald Trump announced that he was running for office. If you recall, neither Republicans nor Democrats really thought that he was viable. You can go look up old Fox News coverage, a couple weeks after he decided that he was running for president, and no one really thinks that he has a chance.
He's never run anything. He's run his business. I don't know if he's run it well, not well. There have been bankruptcies. There have been problems.
Well, he suggests there's 9 billion reasons.
Well, he says he's put out now his assets and liabilities. I think it's kind of hilarious. This is all part of the joke. Once he puts out a tax return, then I'll see. But so far, I know nothing. to get back to Oprah, I think that's great. But you know why he needs a running mate? It's because Yogi needed boo-boo. You know what I mean? Sanford needed Son.
Also in the Constitution.
Lucy needed Ethel. And this is a TV show. And that's what he's putting on. He's putting on a TV show.
And we're helping.
And yeah, I think we are helping big time. But I must say, as a Democrat, I'm like, well, go right ahead.
Absolutely.
Help
Knock
yourself.
yourselves out.
Check it out. Why would I get in the way of a Republican, self-immolation?
Does he hurt the process?
Oh, terrible. Are you kidding? If you're a serious Republican, Eric, do you think you're helped by having him on the stage with you?
No, I don't think you're helped personally, but I think the American people are helped because now they have to address some of the things that Donald Trump addresses that these guys don't want to talk about.
You think these are serious issues?
Well,
you're talking about serious issues?
You may not like the way he's talking about him, or you may not like the way he's delivering him, or you may not like Donald Trump personally.
No, I
but
like
he's certainly
Donald Trump.
saying some things that are resonating with the American people.
But do you actually think that somebody on stage, say Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, whoever, Ted Cruz, take your pick, that they should, on the debate stage, the moderator should say, Mr. Rubio, Trump says that he's going to bring back all the jobs from China. How do you respond? And, like, the candidates are supposed to respond to that? Like, how actually is Donald Trump going to bring back all the jobs from China? And here's the thing for him. This is where the rubber meets the road. He's now a declared candidate. So when you say stuff like, yeah, I think Oprah should be the vice president, sure. Well, actually, now you're going to have to be back up on it. And so in the morning, then you have to go on Fox and Friends and go, well, wait, I didn't really mean that. What I meant to say was. And it's just a totally different ballgame.
No, but how's this? Every one of the debate moderators are looking forward to that moment where they can say, Mr. Trump said this. How do you respond, Rand? Or how do you respond, Marco or Jeb? And everyone in America is going to go, wait, let me see what Jeb says about what he said.
Yeah, this is all entertainment. This is a farce.
Because then they will want to know what Jeb says. And Jeb will,
how would you answer that? How would you say, how would you bring back all the jobs from China?
First of all, I don't know that Donald ever said he'll bring back all the jobs.
He said
from
it in
China,
his speech yesterday.
But you can certainly bring back some jobs from China.
And like covering up for him is actually wrong.
Even watch the debate footage. The early Republican primary debates back in 2016. No one thought that he had a chance, and they berated him constantly.
With Donald Trump front and center, candidates took direct aim.
I think Mr. Trump is a wonderful entertainer.
Mr. Trump, we don't need an apprentice in the White House. His visceral response to attack people on their appearance, short, tall, fat, ugly. My goodness, that happened in junior high. Are we not way above that? Would we not all be worried to have someone like that in charge of the nuclear arsenal?
Trump fired right back.
I never attacked him on his look, and believe me, there's plenty of subject matter right there. That I can tell you.
Then this question to Carly Fiorina.
Last week in Rolling Stone magazine, Donald Trump said the following about you, quote, "Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?" Please feel free to respond.
I think women all over this country heard very clearly what Mr. Trump said.
Trump's response was not received well.
I think she's got a beautiful face, and I think she's a beautiful woman.
All right,
Fiorina is getting high marks for her performance and scored some of the most memorable moments of the night.
I very much hope that I am the only person on this stage who can say this, but I know there are millions of Americans out there who will say the same thing. My husband Frank and I buried a child to drug addiction.
In this riveting moment, Jeb Bush told Donald Trump he should apologize to his Mexican-born wife.
To subject my wife into the middle of a raucous political conversation was completely inappropriate, and I hope you apologize for that, Donald.
Well, I have to tell you, I hear phenomenal things. I hear your wife is a lovely woman.
She is.
I
She's
don't
fantastic.
know her, and this
she
is a total
absolutely the love of my life, and
mischaracterization of what
she's
I
right
said.
here, and why don't you apologize for her?
No, I won't
right
do that
now.
because I said nothing wrong.
So we can see that early on, not everyone was a huge fan of Donald Trump, but as his campaign gained momentum and he won early primary after primary, remember we called this the bandwagon effect, ultimately he wins the presidency. And then so the conservative media, as well as the Republican Party, ultimately had to rally behind him to unify the party. And they continue to do so today. I love this clip here. Despite Donald Trump spanking Rand Paul like a little baby during that debate that we just watched, he was one of Trump's major defenders throughout the impeachment inquiry.
Foreign aid is always contingent upon behavior. In fact, the money we gave him to give to Ukraine, it says specifically in the law he has to certify that they are less prone to corruption. So, I mean, he was instructed by Congress to do exactly what he asked to be done.
So you're saying that you think that President Trump was actually doing this because he was combating corruption. This is, of course, a president.
Well, yeah, there are all kinds of accusations that Burisma and Hunter Biden and the company were corrupt, and the founder of the company was corrupt.
So this really illustrates how important party unity is to the parties. And so some of the reasons that we see parties cling so strongly to the president is really a part of this twofold process. First, you have a significant decline in party power. If you need a refresher on that, see the campaigns lecture as well as the Congress lecture. And second, the powers of the presidency have grown enormously over time. When George Washington was president, there were only 3 executive departments: the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of War, which later became known as the Department of Defense. Today, there are 15. In 1789, the federal bureaucracy consisted of about 50 employees. Today, there's close to 2 million federal civilian employees. So right off the bat, the expansion of the federal bureaucracy, aka the executive, has obviously led to a massive increase in presidential power because the president presides over the executive. So recall all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about the factors that influence the balance of federalism between the state governments and the national government. These are the same factors that contribute to increasing executive power. Economic decline, national crises, and technological developments generally lead to an increase of executive power. So during the Great Depression, FDR massively expanded the federal bureaucracy to help jumpstart employment and economic activity. We talked about how LBJ was able to drastically enhance the president's military power with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Vietnam. And George W. Bush even created a brand new executive department, the Department of Homeland Security, in the aftermath of the terrorist attack of 9/11. So considering the scope and the sheer size of the federal bureaucracy, it's not surprising that a lot of Americans equate running a country to running a business. In fact, the number of businessmen seeking political office, or people who have at some point served as a CEO, a chairperson, a founder, or an owner of a massive corporation, has skyrocketed over the last 2 decades. And as you can see from the graph here, this is really a function of globalization, which is the second cause of the expansion of presidential power. New developments in industry and technology have contributed to our world being more connected than ever before. Information is processed instantaneously, and since the United States has established itself as a world leader in several industrial sectors and constitutes one of the largest economies in the global marketplace, that means that the failures in our own economic sectors are felt worldwide. We saw it happen under President Obama during the 2008 financial crisis, and we're seeing it again right now under President Trump with the coronavirus pandemic that's fueling economic uncertainty worldwide. And it's these international crises that fuel the expansion of presidential power. So if you've been keeping up with the news lately, you've probably heard of something called the Defensive Production Act, which essentially gives the federal government power to seize the production of private companies, which that might sound a little bit scary. But again, in times of crisis, people are, a little bit more willing to give up some of their rights for a more powerful federal government to keep everyone safe, right? It goes all the way back to what we talked about in Leviathan with Thomas Hobbes. So the DPA has origins dating all the way back to the 1940s, which gave FDR the power to seize the production of the Ford Motor Company to make tanks and vehicles during World War II. And even though the invocation of the DPA is generally used as a wartime power, Trump recently invoked the DPA, directing General Motors to produce ventilators needed for the coronavirus outbreak. So we're actually seeing an expansion of presidential power unfolding right before our eyes. And just like we talked about a few slides ago, the declining role of parties in electoral politics has really paved the way for more powerful individual candidates. If presidents have strong approval ratings, this makes the president's endorsement of lower-level candidates extremely important. And even more so if a president leaves office, being quite popular, this makes the endorsement of future presidential candidates very attractive for candidates. And lastly, the increased variety of new media outlets like Twitter give politicians more options than ever to speak directly to the American public without the interference or gatekeeping function of the traditional news media. So all of these things help make the office of the executive more powerful. Okay, and the last factor that has contributed to the expansion of executive power is this interpretation of implied powers. So most of this boils down to the president's loose interpretation of the take care clause that we talked about from Article 2 earlier in the lecture. Remember, the take care clause in Article 2 is the source of the president's implied powers. And over time, as presidents slowly expand their interpretation of this clause, they essentially expand the precedent that presidents, that might be a little bit confusing to hear. What I'm saying is, over time, as presidents slowly expand their interpretation of the take care clause, what they're doing is they're essentially expanding the precedent that presidents set for the powers of office. We'll talk more about precedents in the judicial chapter, and what exactly that means and why it's important. But there's lots of examples we can look to historically that illustrate how, slight increases in the interpretation of the president's power ultimately get bigger and bigger and bigger as, each one of those actions build upon each other, and they allow the president to slowly have more and more powers. In the name of defending the Constitution, President Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War, thus prohibiting Confederate detainees from seeking relief for unlawful detention. During the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt established a practice of recommending a presidential program and budget to Congress, which still continues today. President LBJ massively expanded the president's power of the military during Vietnam, which we talked about a lot earlier. And together, these four elements, bureaucratic expansion, globalization, new media, and the interpretation of the Take Care Clause, have drastically increased the power of the presidency. Though it's important to keep in mind that the president does not have absolute power. Even though presidential power has grown significantly over time, especially far more than what the Founding Fathers ever envisioned for the office in the 1700s, the power of the presidency is still checked by other branches of government. And I just wanted to provide a quick recap on some of those most prominent checks and balances in government. So remember, the president enforces the law. He does not make the law. He can introduce policy agenda to Congress via the State of the Union address. He can also veto legislation, but that is checked by Congress's power to override vetoes. The president is free to nominate whoever he chooses for executive, judicial, or diplomatic positions. However, all nominations must be approved by the Senate. And the president does have significant military powers at his disposal, but ultimately, Congress decides which military endeavors do and do not receive funding. The last thing that we have to talk about is presidential character. And just like we talked about in the media chapter, the onset of television and televised debates and social media have really amplified the importance of presidential character in modern politics. And I think with the last few elections and the current state of politics, it's becoming abundantly clear that some Americans are completely fine overlooking policy expertise and qualifications and instead rely more heavily on the candidate's characteristics as the primary metric for whether or not they want to vote for that candidate. And there's three aspects of candidate character that I think are important to discuss. That's appearance, intellect, and charisma. There's a great deal of political science literature that suggests female candidates are often judged more on their appearance than they are on their policy platforms, their ideas, or their agenda. So from the cost of their wardrobes to the amount of time that's spent on doing their hair and their makeup, women candidates often face unique gender-specific obstacles when they run for office. In some countries, opposition to female candidates is so visceral that some have even resorted to the dissemination of fabricated nude photographs of those candidates in efforts to discredit those female candidates' political campaigns. Intellect and competence is another aspect of presidential character that plays a big role in shaping how the public and even the media perceive the candidate. President George W. Bush's frequent verbal gaffes and mispronunciations were a constant theme of discussion among major media outlets.
If you're a single mother with 2 children, which is the toughest job in America as far as I'm concerned, and you're working hard to put food on your family, those who think that they can say we're only going to have a stimulus package, but let's forget tax relief, underestimate. Just making sure you were paying attention. You were. I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully. The responses have got to end in order for us to get the framework, the groundwork, not framework, the groundwork to discuss a framework for peace, to lay the... All right.
And lastly, charisma kind of encompasses that gut feeling that we have towards political candidates. Both President Clinton and President Obama had a natural gift for oration. If you read accounts from people who attended Bill Clinton's early campaign events, they'll often say things like, Bill Clinton had this natural talent for public speaking, and even in the smallest, most crowded room, he could make you feel like he was speaking directly to you. And this gut reaction, or this intuition, I think it manifests in lots of different ways. It could be how we feel about the candidate when we hear them speak. It could be how genuine we perceive their actions to be. And this was a major problem for Hillary Clinton, this concept of being genuine. I think a lot of people felt that she was fake or disingenuous or too tangled up with the political establishment to really be relatable to the average American. And Donald Trump, on the other hand, I think for the most part, his completely unfiltered rhetoric on the campaign trail, I think that's what really resonated with the people most. People like that he speaks his mind. And the fact that he's not politically correct whatsoever really generates this image of authenticity that I think a lot of people perceived as a fresh breath of air, something new on the political landscape. And I think that contributed greatly to his election. Presidential character is so important that it has motivated an entire strain of political science literature. Presidential scholar James David Barber created a typology of presidential character, style, and worldview that helps political scientists predict presidential performance. So while style involves how a president does his job, and worldview involves how a president perceives politics, issues, and conflict, character captures how a president views himself. So some enter office with a great deal of self-assurance, having pursued a career in politics for the personal challenge and gratification, and others have entered office seeking to please those around them and follow a sense of duty or exercise control over others. According to Barber, presidents have either an active or a passive approach to their job. They can attack the duties of the office each day with the ultimate goal of accomplishing much by the end of the administration's end, or they can occupy the office out of a sense of duty, be receptive to input from others, and depend on others for self-affirmation. According to this analysis, presidents also have either a positive outlook or a negative outlook on the world. Some take more pleasure in the job than others, often depending on whether they enjoy the exercise of power or feel burdened by it. In general, these two dimensions and 4 resulting presidential personalities capture what presidents do and how they feel about what they do. Most scholars argue that President Trump falls into the active negative category, and there's no doubt that he's active. Between the constant press conferences, the telephone interviews, and the tweeting, he is on the job 24/7. But is he positive or is he negative? I think President Trump does receive some enjoyment or gratification from the job that he does. But Barber would argue it's not the type of enjoyment that he's trying to measure. This is Barber's description of the active negative. The active negative type is, in the first place, much taken up with self-concern. His attention keeps returning to himself, his problems, how he is doing, as if he were forever watching himself. The character of that attention is primarily evaluative with respect to power. Am I winning or losing? Gaining or failing? Barber also adds this. The active negative lives in a dangerous world. A world not only threatening in a definite way, but also highly uncertain. A world one can cope with only by maintaining a tense, wary readiness for danger. The prime threat is other people. He tends to divide humanity into the weak and the grasping, although he may also, with no feeling of inconsistency, idealize the people in a romantic way. So what do you think? Do you think President Trump fits the description of an active negative? Do you think he has any active positive traits? I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture, and I'd like you to think about Barber's typology and how this might influence presidents' management of the federal bureaucracy, which we will discuss in much more detail next week. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next week.